Centuries ago, when the world was vastly harsh and ruthless, people survived not thanks to modern technology or comfort, but solely due to a set of unique skills and instincts honed in the struggle with nature and hostile environment. Every day brought new challenges: freezing cold, hunger, attacks by wild animals, and human squabbles where weakness could cost lives. In these conditions, there was no right to make a mistake, and only those who possessed ancient knowledge and knew how to apply it could hope to survive. Modern man often considers himself distant from these realities, believing that the age of technology and comfort has left such skills in the past. But what if it is the forgotten medieval skills can be a lifeline in any extreme situation? What are the secrets of ancient shepherds, warriors, and ordinary people who lived in those hard times? Can today teach endurance, cunning, and fortitude? Why are these skills, endurance, the ability to find food, to keep warm in the cold, to protect oneself, still relevant even centuries later? It's interesting to understand exactly what skills were vital back then and why every modern survivalist is required to know them. This issue is created for those who want to touch the true power of the past and arm themselves with knowledge that will help not to break in any situation, no matter what. Identification of edible plants and medicinal herbs. During the Middle Ages, knowledge of nature was a matter of life and death, especially for peasants and shepherds who had no access to doctors or pharmacies and relied solely on their own skills and observations to identify edible plants and medicinal herbs. Everyone out in the field or pasture had to distinguish between useful gifts of nature and deadly poisons, for one wrong decision could lead to poisoning and even death. Experience was passed down from generation to generation. Elders learned from their ancestors by collecting and sorting plants, memorizing how they looked, smelled, and tasted, as well as what diseases they helped. For the medieval peasant, the ability to recognize useful herbs, such as nettle, plantain, St. John's wort, or yarrow, was not just a craft, but a real science, including knowledge of seasonality and place of growth. Medicinal herbs were used to treat wounds, infections, stomach ailments, and even epidemics, and despite the lack of modern medicines, often saved lives. In numerous chronicles and herbariums of those times, there are descriptions of herbalists and witch doctors who collected plants in certain phases of the moon, believing that it was then that the healing power of herbs was strongest. This knowledge was accompanied by folk beliefs and rituals that strengthened the belief in the healing power of nature and its connection with the spiritual world. Shepherds, who spent a long time in isolation in nature, knew which leaves and roots could be used for food if the usual supply ran out, and knew how to prepare decoctions from them that warmed the body and strengthened the immune system during the harsh winter nights. Often herbs served not only as medicine, but also as a kind of protection. For example, sprigs of wormwood and heather were hung in the dwelling to ward off evil spirits and diseases. Learning this wisdom began in childhood, and mistakes were not forgiven. One wrong step in choosing a plant could cost health and even life. For a medieval shepherd or peasant, correctly recognizing edible and poisonous plants was as important a skill as knowing how to handle a weapon or build a fire. Historical records and archaeological evidence confirm that it was plants that played a key role in sustaining communities, especially in times of famine and epidemics. Thus, these lost skills of knowing nature and its gifts become today an invaluable lesson in survival, reminding us how close man was to the earth and its cycles. In modern life, where most have lost touch with nature, revitalizing this knowledge can not only broaden the survivalist's horizons, but also strengthen the connection to ancient wisdom tested over the centuries. These skills are not just ancient relics, but a living foundation on which to build an understanding of the world around us and our own ability to stay alive in the most challenging environments. Starting a fire without modern appliances. In the medieval world, the ability to make and maintain a fire was a key survival skill, especially for those who spent nights outdoors. Shepherds, peasants, and warriors, for whom a spark and a flame meant life and warmth in cold and damp conditions. The art of making fire without modern matches and lighters was based on the use of flint and a flamethrower, a metal plate of iron or steel that was quickly struck against the flint. causing sparks to fall on a prepared, easily ignitable substance, most often rubbish, dried moss, bark, or grass. This ancient method was known in Europe already in ex-19 centuries and was passed from generation to generation, being not just a craft, but a real ritual, honed to perfection. For a medieval man, knowing how to prepare the right kindling, dry the wood thoroughly, and find the best place to start a fire was the key to survival in the harsh conditions of a winter night. Maintaining a fire in rainy or frosty weather was no less difficult. It was necessary to find dry branches under the snow, sometimes to put birch bark, which burns even when wet, under firewood, and to build a fire so that the wind did not blow out the flame, but at the same time provided an influx of oxygen. Fire served not only as a source of heat, but also as a defense against wild animals, as well as a means for cooking food and medicinal concoctions. Some historical chronicles mention cases when shepherds or travelers built fires in special hollows or under canopies, so that the fire would last longer and would not go out in the rain. The art of making a fire was an integral part of survival for both warriors and peasants. Everyone who went out for the night in the field or forest had to know this skill at the level of instinct. The chronicles of that time often mention firebrands, metal tools, which, sometimes decorated with engravings and symbols, were inherited as family heirlooms, for they guaranteed salvation in trouble. Knowledge of local wood, from linden and alder to pine, was also important, for the quality of the firewood depended on how long and evenly the fire burned. For many medieval communities, the ability to make fire was sacred knowledge, for without it, it was impossible to survive cold winter nights and thunderstorms. Despite its apparent simplicity, making and keeping a fire burning required patience, skill, and precise knowledge, because to miss the choice of material or to stack wood incorrectly meant risking being left out in the cold without heat or light. Nowadays, when modern technology is available at the snap of a finger, these skills seem forgotten, but they could save lives in extreme conditions, where no match burns and no lighter helps. Returning to these ancient methods is not just a way to remember history, but also a chance to understand the true meaning of fire in the culture and life of medieval man. To feel its value and learn how to use the power of nature in the most difficult situations. Fire obtained with one's own hands became a symbol of endurance, skill, and hope, which was passed on by word of mouth, preserving the link between generations and overcoming time. Building a temporary shelter from natural materials. In medieval times, when the road or pasture could take one far from the village, the ability to quickly and efficiently build a temporary shelter became a vital skill to survive a cold and windy night in the field or forest. Shepherds and peasants often used whatever was at hand, branches, tree bark, grass, and earth, to erect a tent to provide protection from the weather and wild animals. The construction was based on a framework of strong branches found in the nearest thickets or under fallen trees, which were fastened to each other with bark straps or simply intertwined. This frame was then covered with layers of bark, moss, and dry grass, which provided not only protection from the wind, but also good thermal insulation, the most important factor for survival on a frosty night. It is known that even the documents of the 12th century mentioned methods of building such temporary dwellings, which could be very simple, but at the same time surprisingly stable and able to protect from wind and snow. For additional protection, earth mounds were often used at the base of the tent, which not only retained heat but also served as a barrier against slippery wind and meltwater. Grass and moss laid on the roof and walls created a natural layer of insulation, absorbing moisture and keeping heat inside, similar to modern insulation materials. In some regions, more complex constructions were practiced, where branches were intertwined in the form of a lattice and flat stones or clay were laid inside, which made the shelter more durable and long-lasting, able to protect from heavy snowfalls and fierce winds. Such skills were especially valued in the northern and mountainous regions, where winters lasted long and were especially severe. In chronicles, one can find stories about shepherds who built such huts even in winter blizzards, sometimes staying there for several days, guarding their flocks from wolves and bears. It was also important to choose the right place for the shelter, in a low-lying area or at the bottom of a hill to avoid drafts and snow accumulation, and not too close to the forest to avoid being threatened by wild animals. Some craft treatises of the Middle Ages also advised orienting oneself to the local winds and even the sun, building a shelter on the south side so that it would be warmed by the sun's rays during the day. In places where many deciduous trees were available, their leaves and bark were used, and in coniferous forests, branches with conifer needles, which also had warming and antiseptic properties. Such temporary dwellings, though seemingly simple, were the result of centuries of knowledge passed down from generation to generation and epitomized the flexibility and ingenuity that helped humans survive in the harshest of environments. These skills, almost lost in today's world of comfort and technology, can now serve not only as a history lesson, but also as a practical guide for those who are passionate about survival and seek to understand how our ancestors coped with the vast nature and harsh elements. Each shelter echoes the echo of life that has been lived for centuries, and every branch, every piece of bark, reminds us that man is able to find protection and warmth even in the most unfavorable circumstances, if he is able to listen carefully to nature and respect its gifts. Hunting and trapping small game with simple tools. During the Middle Ages, when every piece of food could be a matter of life and death, the ability to hunt and catch these small game with the simplest tools was a key skill for shepherds, peasants, and travelers, whose livelihood depended on dexterity and resourcefulness. Simple traps and snares made from improvised materials such as ropes, twigs, stones, and even pieces of bark were widely used to catch small animals such as hares, birds, and small rodents. These primitive but very effective devices could be arranged in a variety of ways, from sting traps strung on paths to pitfall traps with pressed branches that were triggered at the slightest touch of an animal. Historical sources, including the records of monastic chronicles, confirm that such traps were widespread, from English pastures to the forests of Central Europe, where a simple peasant or shepherd could provide food even in the most famine-stricken times. In addition to traps, spear throwing, an art that required strength, marksmanship, and patience, was of great importance. The manufacture of spears and arrows was the work of artisans and hunters themselves, who used branches of wood, carefully dried and processed, and turned their tips from bone, stone, or metal. Sometimes arrows and spears were fitted with small iron tips, if access to a blacksmith allowed, but more often they were made from available natural materials, which required special skill on the part of the hunter to hit the target accurately. Throwing weapons became not just a way of hunting, but a real art of survival, on which depended not only food, but also defense against predators. Camouflage was also important. Hunters knew how to use the surrounding vegetation and terrain to approach game unnoticed, trying not to make unnecessary sounds and hiding in the shade of trees. Historical chronicles describe how shepherds and wanderers often went hunting in the mornings and evenings, when animals were particularly active, so as not to miss the moment for a successful prey. Birds, for example, could be caught with special nets or cunning traps consisting of intertwined branches and stones, which were instantly closed when a bird was caught. This method of food extraction required not only physical endurance, but also an in-depth knowledge of animal behavior, when they feed, where they nest, what paths they choose most often. Often experienced hunters were a kind of scientist, observing nature and studying its cycles to predict the behavior of game. Medieval manuscripts contain advice and instructions on trap and weapon making and throwing techniques, demonstrating the importance of this craft in everyday life. Although seemingly primitive, these skills were the key to survival during the hungry winter months, when grain supplies were running low and livestock needed additional food. The ability to hunt with improvised means allowed the herder not only to feed himself, but also to retain the strength necessary to protect the herd and defend the territory. This skill set, often lost in the modern era, is now of renewed interest to survivalists and historians seeking to understand and master ancient methods of interacting with nature. In every successfully caught hare, in every accurate arrow is reflected 1,000 years of experience, tested by time and harsh life, which still holds the keys to survival in the most difficult conditions. Protection from wild animals and thieves. In the harsh conditions of medieval life, shepherds and peasants had to constantly fight not only against the natural elements, but also against the real threat of wild animals and human robbers, who were waiting for them on the road or in the night camp. To defend themselves from wolves, bears, and other predators, They most often used improvised weapons, simple but reliable sticks, spears, and knives, which were an integral part of every shepherd's equipment. Historical chronicles tell us that shepherds were often the first to face danger and courageously repelled attacks of beasts, protecting their flock and themselves. To increase security around the camp, watch points, small fences or plantations of thorny branches that prevented animals from sneaking up unnoticed, were built around the camp. In addition to direct defense with weapons, medieval shepherds also resorted to clever tactics. They set signal traps and simple warning systems based on noise and traps. For example, stretched thin ropes or fishing lines fitted with bells or metal objects would emit a loud sound when someone tried to enter the camp, warning of approaching danger. Such signaling systems were not only effective, but also widespread, as evidenced by the remains of metal bells and small bells found by archaeologists, which were probably used for just such purposes. To combat robbers and vagabonds, who often fished in remote areas, shepherds carried not only weapons, but also developed skills of stealth and observation in order to notice approaching danger in advance and warn their companions. In addition, some communities practiced joint night vigils, shifts of shepherds that alternated so that no night went unguarded. A number of medieval sources even mention the simplest alarm systems using fire and smoke, which could warn neighboring villages of an attack by robbers or the approach of wild animals. It is worth noting that defense against animals and people often required not only physical strength, but also the ability to quickly navigate the environment, to seek shelter, to use natural obstacles such as ravines and dense bushes to slow down the enemy or beast. The bravery, experience, and instincts of the herder were often crucial in the fight for life, especially when powerful weapons or support were not at hand. At the intersection of practical knowledge and traditional beliefs, special rituals and customs were developed to protect themselves, such as wearing amulets or performing certain prayers to ward off evil spirits and enemies. Thus, defense against wild animals and thieves in the Middle Ages was a complex task, requiring from man not only physical skills, but also ingenuity, the ability to anticipate danger and make quick decisions in extreme conditions. This knowledge and skills, tested by time and decades of struggle against nature and human cruelty, today seem almost forgotten, but they can still serve as inspiration for modern survivalists and those who want to understand how a skillful man can resist the elements and enemies, relying on simple but effective methods of defense. Food preparation and storage in the absence of a refrigerator. In the medieval world, when refrigerators did not exist, the ability to preserve food for a long time became a matter of survival, especially in harsh winter conditions, when fresh food disappeared from sight for months. The main methods of preservation were drying, smoking, and salting of meat and fish, which allowed to preserve the nutrition and edibility of products while avoiding rapid spoilage. Traditional drying methods were used everywhere. Meat or fish was cut into thin slices and hung in the sun or over the smoke of a fire, where the dry air and heat helped to remove moisture and prevent the development of bacteria. In some regions, special rooms or cellars were set up to store dried food, where the coolness and dryness helped preserve the food until the next harvest or hunting season. Smoking was a particularly valuable process that not only extended shelf life, but also imparted a distinctive flavor to the product, which also served as a protection against insects and decay. Smoking used smoke from coniferous or hardwood trees, carefully selecting the wood to get the right flavor and properties. Salting is another ancient and widespread method, based on a high concentration of salt that prevents the development of microorganisms that destroy food. Lard, meat, and fish were laid in layers in wooden barrels or tubs, covered with salt, sometimes adding spices and herbs, which also helped to preserve food and even improved its flavor. An important part of winter supplies were root vegetables, turnips, carrots, onions, beets, which were dug in late fall and stored in special cellars or pits covered with straw and earth to maintain optimal temperature and humidity. Forest berries, nuts, and dried fruits were also collected and carefully dried, placed in cloth sacks or wooden boxes to provide a source of vitamins during the cold season. Archaeological evidence confirms that as early as the Middle Ages, there were special storage facilities with carefully organized stockpiles, all part of a traditional survival culture passed down through generations. Despite the apparent simplicity of the methods, food preparation required knowledge and experience. Improper storage could lead to food spoilage and even poisoning. In some regions, smokehouses with controlled smoke and temperature regimes were used to enhance preservation, which gave the best results. Another trick was that in winter, at sub-zero temperatures, food was often taken outside or into specially equipped winter houses. The natural cold served as a kind of refrigerator, slowing down rotting processes. Food preparation and storage became a community-wide endeavor. Men were engaged in hunting and meat preparation, women in gathering and drying berries, herbs and vegetables, and children helped in preparing and storing supplies, making this process an integral part of life and winter preparation. Historical chronicles and medieval treatises contain numerous recommendations on the best ways to store food, confirming that this knowledge was not just a household skill, but a true art essential to survival. For the modern survivalist, returning to these skills may be the key to a successful long-term stay in a wilderness environment where technology and conveniences are absent. Thus, medieval methods of food preparation and storage show that even without modern refrigerators and preservatives, man could effectively preserve food using natural resources and simple time-honored techniques. This knowledge, full of practical wisdom and reverence for the earth and its gifts, remains relevant today, offering every survivalist valuable lessons in patience, planning, and food preservation. Orienteering skills without a map or compass. During the Middle Ages, when modern navigational instruments had not yet been invented, the ability to navigate in nature was not just a useful skill, but a vital one for those who traveled through forests, mountains, and vast plains. People relied on careful observation of their surroundings, the position of the sun in the sky during the day, and the stars at night, using them to determine the sides of the world and the direction of travel. The sun rising in the east and setting in the west served as a natural compass, and knowledge of the time of day allowed for course correction even in conditions of limited visibility. In addition to the luminaries, medieval travelers carefully studied the mosses, lichens, and vegetation that traditionally grew on the north side of trees or rocks. This natural indicator helped them understand where the cold and shady side was, which was especially important in dense forests. The direction of the winds was also taken into account, as the constant winds blow from certain directions, and this knowledge was enshrined in local legends and oral traditions. Shepherds, hunters, and wanderers memorized key landmarks, unusual trees, stones with markings, river bends, so that they could return home or lead the herd through familiar routes without the risk of getting lost. The skills of memorizing routes were passed down from generation to generation, and people who made long journeys used methods of marking the way, leaving signs on trees, stacking small stone pyramids, or conspicuous branches to avoid straying from the path. These natural and artificial landmarks became a kind of map, understandable only to the initiated, and were often accompanied by oral stories and legends that helped to memorize the sequence of key points of the path. In chronicles of that time, one can find descriptions of travelers who traversed entire regions based only on observations of nature, which proves the high degree of their skill and trust in these methods. In addition, many medieval people knew that on clear nights the star Polaris, which was almost stationary in the north, served as a reliable landmark, especially in the northern latitudes of Europe. This knowledge allowed not only to understand the sides of the world, but also to avoid night wanderings, which could end tragically because of the cold or wild animals. The shadow of a stick was used to accurately determine the direction during the day. With its help, it was possible to calculate the south and, accordingly, the other sides of the world, which was one of the simplest and most accessible ways of orienteering. Bad weather, fog, snowfall, or thick clouds blocked the sun and stars, was a serious challenge, and at such times the skill of reading moss, winds, and sounds of nature became especially important. Water sounds, bird cries, and even the location of anthills could serve as clues in difficult conditions when familiar landmarks disappeared from sight. In such situations, not only acute observation was required, but also an inner sense of direction, which came with the experience of long wanderings and life in nature. Archaeological finds and historical records show that in some regions there were even special guides, people with exceptional knowledge of the terrain who accompanied travelers and trade caravans to help them safely reach their desired destination. It was this experience based on observation, memorization, and a keen understanding of nature that laid the foundation for the development of more sophisticated navigational technologies in the centuries that followed. For the modern survivalist, knowledge of ancient skills of orienteering without maps and compasses remains invaluable. It teaches you to rely on your senses, attention, and observation, which in extreme conditions can be a matter of life and death. Returning to these roots helps not only to survive, but also to understand nature and one's abilities in it more deeply, connecting with the wisdom of generations who have passed through the trials of the wild elements. Preparation of therapeutic herbal infusions and ointments. In medieval villages where hospitals and pharmacies were inaccessible, knowing how to prepare medicinal herbal infusions and ointments was a matter of life and death, especially for those who lived far from cities and monasteries. Knowledge of the healing properties of plants was passed down from generation to generation, often in secret, and was based on the experience of hundreds of years of observation of nature and its gifts. Folk healers, herbalists, and even simple peasants knew how to extract from the leaves, roots, and flowers of plants infusions, decoctions and ointments that relieved pain, inflammation, and accelerated the healing of wounds. The infusions were made with boiled water or a weak alcohol solution in which herbs such as chamomile, yarrow, sage, and St. John's wort were placed. These plants had antiseptic and anti-inflammatory properties that helped fight infections and bleeding. Ointments were prepared on the basis of animal fat or wax mixed with crushed herbs, which allowed not only to apply the medicine to the wound, but also to protect it from penetration of dirt and cold. Chronicles and manuscripts of monasteries contain recipes for such remedies, which were used not only for ordinary wounds, but also to combat the effects of snake bites and even poisoning. Special attention was also paid to the spiritual aspect of healing. Belief in the power of herbs and the rituals that accompanied the process of preparing and applying ointments were considered an integral part of the healing process. Many herbalists recited prayers or incantations over the remedies, believing that peace of mind and faith in recovery enhanced the effects of natural remedies. This interaction of physical and spiritual treatment was not accidentally reflected in folk beliefs and rituals. When the patient was recommended not only to apply ointments, but also to observe rest, and sometimes even to participate in religious ceremonies to enhance the effect. Medieval chronicles often mention cases where, even in conditions of war or famine, such tinctures and ointments brought wounded peasants and soldiers back to life, and diseases that seemed fatal receded. Historians note that knowledge of herbs allowed rural communities to stay healthy in a harsh environment where medical care was far away and expensive. The preparation of these remedies required not only knowledge of botany, but also patience and the ability to choose the right time to collect herbs. In the morning hours, before dawn, or after sunset, when the concentration of healing substances was highest. In addition, many plants had a double meaning. They were used not only for healing, but also for protection from evil spirits and the diseases they brought, which enhanced the psychological effect and helped fight despair and fear. Different regions had their own unique recipes and traditions reflecting local flora and culture, making folk medicine a living and flexible art capable of adapting to different conditions. This heritage allows us today, looking back, to understand the depth and strength of the human connection with nature and the importance of preserving and passing on such skills, which can help not only in extreme conditions, but also in everyday life. Thus, the preparation of medicinal infusions and ointments from herbs is not just a set of recipes, but a whole philosophy of survival and care for yourself and your loved ones, combining experience, observation, and faith in the healing power of nature. Manual labor skills, basket weaving, repairing clothes and tools. In the medieval world, where every item was worth its weight in gold and access to markets or artisans was often limited, the ability to create and repair everyday objects on one's own became a necessity for every peasant and survivalist. Weaving baskets from vine or straw was not just a craft, but an art that allowed to store and carry food, collect firewood and hunting trophies, thus ensuring survival in conditions of limited resources and harsh nature. These baskets were characterized not only by their functionality, but also by their durability, creating a reliable and durable container that could hold heavy loads and last for more than 1 year. Clothing repairs, which included sewing up rips and strengthening seams, kept people warm and protected them from the weather, because a new set of clothes was a luxury not available to everyone. In winter and weather conditions, a torn shoe or a worn-out coat could mean death from the cold. So knowledge of sewing and leatherwork was passed down from generation to generation, becoming one of the cornerstones of survival. Tools, whether knives, axes, or even farm implements, were also subject to regular wear and tear, and without the ability to sharpen and repair them, it was impossible to keep the farm in working order. Historical sources and archaeological finds testify that peasants and shepherds often made the simplest tools and devices themselves, using improvised materials: wood, bone, stone, and metal, mined or melted by themselves. In conditions of complete isolation or during long campaigns and military campaigns, the ability to solve any technical problem on one's own became a matter of survival and the preservation of fighting ability. Manual labor skills were also closely linked to resilience and psychological preparedness. A person who could create what he needed with his own hands felt in control of the situation and confident about the future. Making and repairing things took a lot of time and required patience and care, but it was these skills that preserved the integrity of things and avoided waste, so valuable in the medieval subsistence economy. In some annals, there are references to special crafts passed down within the family or community, where masters taught young people not only technical techniques, but also respect for labor and resources. Basket weaving, clothing, and tool repair were also associated with certain rituals and traditions that helped to maintain morale and strengthen social ties in the community. Today, looking back on these skills, one can realize that in an era of mass consumption and technological abundance, the simple ability to create and repair with one's own hands is not just nostalgia, but the key to autonomy and independence in the most extreme situations. Returning to these traditional skills can not only enrich the modern survivalist, but also help to better understand how our ancestors lived and overcame difficulties, for whom every day was a struggle and a victory at the same time. It is in these ancient crafts that the wisdom to stay in touch with nature, appreciate resources, and be ready for any challenge lies, making this skill one of the most important in the arsenal of anyone seeking to survive and preserve themselves in the harshest conditions. Stamina and psychological resilience in the face of constant danger. Medieval life did not leave people a moment's peace. The threat of hunger, cold, disease, and war was not a distant prospect, but the very fabric of everyday life. Each new day could begin with the news of a crop failure, an attack by looters, or the death of a loved one. And it was in such circumstances that a special, time-hardened psychological fortitude was formed. People of those centuries did not know the word stress in the modern sense, but lived under its burden every day, having neither psychologists nor medicines, nor simple privacy. Their resilience was formed through routine, religion, and community, where everyone knew their role and felt responsible not only for themselves, but also for others. Stamina was not a luxury, but a condition of survival. A broken man quickly became a burden and died, if not physically, then morally. A mother exhausted by labor, left without a husband after another feudal conflict, still rose at dawn, fed her children, spun wool, and went to the field, not allowing herself to be weak. The shepherd, on duty at night by the fire in the freezing cold, knew that the life of the flock and the well-being of the whole village depended on his vigilance, and this knowledge gave him strength. The soldier who had spent weeks in the damp woods with bad weapons and torn shoes held on not so much to food as to faith in God, in his unit, in his right to return home. Historical chronicles such as the Anglo-Saxon Annals and the Lives of the Saints are replete with descriptions of situations where spiritual and mental fortitude proved stronger than hunger and the sword. Community support played a huge role. People survived thanks to mutual help, advice from elders, common prayers, and even simple joint labor, which distracted from fear. Priests, headmen, and witch doctors had not only spiritual, but also therapeutic functions. They helped people to cope with inner despair, which was not called out loud, but which was eating away at them from the inside. Rituals such as daily prayer, lighting a lamp, telling stories, or reciting psalms gave meaning to what was happening, strengthened the psyche, and created a sense of order in the midst of chaos. Medieval man learned from childhood to endure pain and loss, and these lessons had no finality. Life continued to test until it took everything away. But it was this constant pressure that shaped individuals capable of living without complaint, of moving forward despite any circumstances, and of preserving human dignity even in the mud and blood. Today, such resilience seems unattainable, but it is based on simple things: discipline, faith, the support of others, and a sense of personal responsibility for survival. It is not about courage as heroism, but about the strength that quietly sprouts in a person every time he or she does not give up. Medieval man rarely talked about fear, but he knew how to live with it. And it was this inner resource, endurance of the spirit, not of the muscles, that was his main weapon against winter, war, and time. Through the ashes of centuries, we hear the rustle of those simple but powerful skills that were possessed by everyone who was destined to survive the harshness of the Middle Ages. They were not super warriors, wizards, or heroes of tales. They were ordinary men and women who lived in shacks, wore coarse wool, and fought every day not against the enemy, but against cold, hunger, and fear. Their strength lay in their knowledge, in their patience, in the fact that they did not complain but did, step by step, year by year. The world has changed, but survival is still the same ancient dance with nature, with loneliness, with fatigue. And today, when civilization fails, when anxiety returns to our hearts, it is clear. It is the old, forgotten skills that are becoming gold again. The ability to make a fire on wet ground, to recognize a medicinal herb, to weave a basket of willow, to stay calm in the cold darkness. This is the real strength. Not in technology, not in automation, but in a man who knows how to live without anything but will. The medieval survivalist did not wait for salvation. He was his own salvation. It is this experience that is worth listening to today, to become not just stronger, but freer. If this path, the path of knowledge, resilience, and the memory of true courage, is close at hand, it is worth staying with us. There are more stories, skills, and discoveries ahead that aren't talked about in textbooks, but that once saved entire nations. Subscribe to the channel so that you don't lose the thread to the past, which may one day save the future.